during the presentation on debt and constitutionalism, though any panelists can take up the questions as well, was on the issue of public interest litigation. Is it a possible address as a possible address on the issue of debt, and then what is the perspective of the judiciary as it is, and in terms of the independence and capacity, which is also pretty much the same question that was addressed. And the question also extends to are there any example of successful public interest litigations that can be premised for it, the viable options on public debt? Are there successful PILs that we can also hold on or look back to in addressing issues of public debt, and also taking the option of public interest litigation on the same? So, on the regional dimension of debt, then we are looking at are there any regional instruments, so for example, from the YALA, East Africa Legislative Assembly, that are addressing issues of public debt that maybe countries within East Africa can also borrow from or use as a model to develop laws and policies on public debt. Though I know that in Kenya we already have a policy on public debt, but what other legal instruments are there available for the same? And we also had a question during the very first presentation on the oversights, whether debt crisis is as a result of an oversight failure. Lucy raised an issue that the political something that, or some issues that Irene was presenting on, because of time, she was not able to address on political issue, and in relation to the way forward that she was talking about. So maybe Irene can just mention a bit on the political issue, that slide that you wanted to talk about, but you could not get time to address. So those are the questions that I have so far. Panelists can take up any of them. If I need to repeat any question that you might not have noted very well, please just let me know. So I think, Jen, you can go, since I see you're ready. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just go with the first questions that were posed to me. The issue of impunity and disrespect for court orders, as is indeed of great concerns and should be of great concerns to us as Kenyans, because if the judiciary is just disregarded, then really that's it's very unfortunate for any democracy if we get to that level. So in essence, we note the issue of impunity, but we also note that we must continue, therefore, as civil society, as Kenyans, demanding for the safeguarding of the role of the judiciary, which also comes with other issues of how does the judiciary interact with these other organs of state, and what safeguards do we need for the judiciary so that there is no room for intimidation. So for instance, you find that in our country, the judiciary depends on the executive and on parliament for its financing. So what happens is that if judiciary makes decisions that are not favorable to the executive, then they are punished by being denied funding. So how can we safeguard the independence of the judiciary is an issue. If we are able to safeguard it, then the judiciary is able to make those bold decisions. And then there's the issue of the training of the judiciary. Indeed, that's what I was saying. There's need for collaboration between us as lawyers and economists to really break down this issue to even our judicial officers, so that we all understand that it's just not mere speculation, it's not just propaganda. It is indeed true that we are at the verge of a debt crisis or debt distress. So I think there is room for collaboration with the Judiciary Training Institute to see whether we can incorporate in their curriculum issues to do with economics and the economics of the issue of public debt. I think I'll take those two. And if somebody also asked the PIL and what are the strategies, I would think the issues of combining, we are able to combine those issues that we are talking about them and connect them to the issues that really matter to Kenyans: health, education, the social economic rights, the issues of imposition of tax burdens, then I think that would make for a more persuasive argument in court, but it requires a lot of digging and a lot of strategy to just put together and draw those connections. Thank you, Irene.
Okay, thank you. Any other panelists can jump in with another question. I see Leonard said he'll take the question on PIL. Christine, I see you're ready. Just
yes.
unmute.
Hi. Sorry, I got moved. There's a power outage. Respond to that as well. To give the example of the tax justice, the first case succeeded in that the Mauritius DTA was suspended, although the response by government was to have a second DTA. That meant we went to court a second time. But nonetheless, it also gave us an opportunity to look through the other tax treaties that the government had signed. And we have now expanded our case to say that the problem is not only one treaty, but now it's 10 treaties. One thing that has arisen out of this is that there is a change in government behavior in that in 2 other DTAs they have signed or they are thinking of signing, that is with Singapore and Barbados, they have started following the process in that they have even had a call for public participation before at the ministerial level. So we are expecting that probably this will be followed with another call at the parliamentary level, and this will have a cost-benefit analysis with data from KRA and so forth. So those are the things we've been presenting to them. Secondly, with that, with public interest in litigation, as Jen had said, it's a combined strategy. So the communication strategy court case, because of the technical aspect of issues, for the public, we have to then link it to the issues that matter. So it's not only about just simplifying the message, but also broadening the audience. So in that, there are instances where we have to categorically panel beat specific messaging so that people can understand this is the issue going about, whether it's for policymakers or for civil society or for business. There has to be that kind of fashioning of messaging as the process of public interest litigation continues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leonard. Christine?
Thank you, Irene. And very quickly, I'll talk about whether the courts really would be able to understand and interrogate the issue of public debt. I really don't think that would be a problem, because also the courts are empowered to bring on board experts to assist them to understand certain issues. For example, what happened in it's not a good example, but in the presidential election case. So the court can bring a technocrat as amicus, as friend of the court, to assist it to be able to sort out some of these things. I know some of the judges have degrees in business and other things like that. So I don't think it would be a hard sell if we fashion a good public interest litigation case for the judges to miss the point. We also have the ability to call expert evidence on our part to be able to walk the judges through this thing. Lucy has talked about disobedience of court orders. Yes, that's a critical issue. And maybe now the new strategy for PIL is a way to combat this issue of disregard of court orders. And one of the ways people have been talking about this, and there's actually a case on this, it's stored somewhere in the Court of Appeal, but removing immunity. They move immunity in the Government Proceedings Act. They civil and criminal, the immunity against civil and criminal liability for certain acts for public servants, that if you remove that immunity and you have it as they have in South Africa, whereby now consequences will attach to individual public servants, then this issue of backpassing and orders from above might be stemmed a little bit. And of course, the other issue is through advocacy nowadays. So court is not an end to itself. There was also the issue that we were asked about examples of successful PIL case in Kenya. There hasn't been one yet, none has been filed. But we can look at others that have been filed in Africa and have been successful. And I think it's a high time that we also try out the same issue here in Kenya. I think that would be a really good PIL case to bring. Thanks, Irene.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I'll just give Irene Otieno 2 minutes to comment on the political issues. There's a slide, I think, that she did not have time to address. And it touched a bit, the way forward touched a bit on it, on the political issues. Irene, are you ready, or we can give you time in the next session?
I can comment on it on the next session, kindly.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, thank you. So I'll just hold that plenary there for now. I see there's a comment by Peter, but I'd rather address it in the next session and move to now looking at the social economic dimension of public debts. So then what are some of the social and economic issues that we are facing in the country as a result of the now impending debt crisis that we are facing or that we're already in. So we have Okoa Uchumi. Waruguru Kagongo will talk about the debt and its impact on the local communities. Okoa Uchumi is an organization, is a group working in Mombasa, comprising of CSO, businesses, civil society, businesses, and individuals, basically working to ensure that public participation at the local level is enhanced. So I should be talking about that issue of how then is public debt, or what impacts of public debt have been felt at the grassroots. Waruguru, I'll give you 5 minutes, and this time I'll be a lot more strict on time because we have gone overboard. If Waruguru, please just proceed.
Yes, thank you. I assume everyone can hear me. Thanks for organizing this convening. We are glad to have the opportunity to participate. Our coalition is Okoa Mombasa. It's a bit confusing, Okoa Uchumi and Okoa Mombasa, but we are Okoa Mombasa. We work in Mombasa. As Irene has said, we're a coalition of workers' unions, businesses, civil society organizations, and individuals who are concerned about the livelihoods and well-being of the residents of Mombasa. And we are committed to ensuring public participation. So our coalition was formed to respond to the negative impact of the directive that all cargo landing at the Mombasa port should be transported inland via the SGR. We know that the SGR from the previous speakers, the first presentation, the SGR is like the biggest loan that Kenya has taken. It accounts for 90-something% of Kenya's debt. And the SGR itself has been unable to break even. It's been making losses. And so there's very little revenue coming from the SGR itself to pay back the debt. So while the debt is a national issue, I think Mombasa presents a clear case of the impact of that debt being unevenly distributed. Mombasa has disproportionately suffered from the SGR, particularly that directive. I think Mombasa is a logistics hub, and its economy also contributes to the economies of the adjacent counties. So if you take away the logistics businesses that are based in Mombasa, you move them to Nairobi and you move them to Naivasha, then there's an immediate impact on job opportunities and a whole range of services. We're talking about redundancies for drivers, mechanics, spare parts. You know, there's a lot. There are a lot of people who are affected. There's a report that was commissioned by the county government of Mombasa and researched by the University of Nairobi that provides a good overview. They project the kinds of losses that Mombasa as a county would suffer as a result of this directive. I won't go into that, but you can find that report on our website, okoamombasa.org. And basically, the negative effects are not just economic, they've also extended to other social repercussions. We're talking about increased insecurity, we're talking depression and hopelessness among the youth, we're talking drugs, increasing use of drugs and alcohol, abuse, family stresses, homelessness, etc. So as Okoa Mombasa, I think the key concern or our key goal is to push for public participation, because there are real consequences to these deaths on people's livelihoods. We really would like to see public participation strengthened. We would like to see devolution strengthened, so county government having a say especially when these, the impact is so real for residents of a particular county. And we would also like to see more accountability and transparency. We would like to see people taking responsibility, including even individual responsibility for some of these actions that plunge us into this debt crisis. And so we have done some work around that. I won't go into that because I would like to give my colleague, we were sharing this session with my colleague, Waema Gishinga. He's a member of the Long Distance Truck Drivers Union, and he will paint for us a picture of how the SGR debt has affected livelihood. So he's going to give us the personal accounts of some people, his own personal account, and what the community itself has done to challenge this directive. I think as Okoa Mombasa, one of our value adds is to actually bring out the voices of those who are most affected. We would like to hear them in forums such as these, and to just get the sense that we're talking about real people, real livelihoods that have been affected. So over to you, Roma.
I can't hear Roman. Okay, can we proceed and then we come back to him? Maybe you can try get in contact with him. I'd give him 3 minutes a bit later to, okay, I'll give him
I'll get in touch with him, thank you.
Okay, I'll give him like 3 minutes to talk about the effects of public debt that has been felt on the ground. So I'll just move to the next presenter for now, but we will come back to you, Waruguru, and your colleague. So we'll have Daisy Amdani to talk about the issue of debt and gender. So because of time, I'll just run through all the presentations that we have and then take the plenary after the last presentation on debt options for Kenya. So please just bear with us. We are running quite badly on time. So Daisy will come in next to talk about debt and gender in Kenya. So Daisy is the Executive Director of Community Advocacy and Awareness, that is Crown Trust, which is a change catalyst providing African women and girls with tools, voice, and even platform to air what the change they can effect as individuals, family, or community within the region that they're working in. So Daisy, please welcome. You have 5 minutes. Please be sensitive of time. We have completely outdone our time. So at 5 minutes, I'll tell you have 1 more minute to wrap up. So go next. Karibu. You are on mute. Please unmute your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Apologies for that. Good morning to everyone, participants, and thank you to TISA and the Okoa Uchumi Coalition for this very important meeting. I will share my presentation because I had many slides, so I'm just going to speak to it and just try and get into the key highlights. So of course, as has been said by everyone, that the debt is a very big problem. And of course, it is also a gender issue, because as the debt grows, so too does the service. The debt service increases. And of course, this is a particular problem because of the high proportion of revenue that it absorbs, taking away money from much needed services. So this is of particular interest to women because the money that is taken away from other critical issues: water, healthcare, education, housing, so ECOSOC rights. And so when we look at debt from the women's perspective and looking at whether the borrowing has been beneficial to women and women's rights, what we see is that the areas for which debt has been procured, the dominant sectors for which borrowing has been procured is mainly for physical infrastructure. So you're talking about roads, rail. Some of it has gone to agriculture, some of it to natural resources. A little has gone towards social protection, education, health, and addressing issues like violence against women. Now, in agriculture, Kenya's borrowing has been for projects and programs to enhance productivity in the sector, mainly looking at commercializing agriculture and increasing productivity and the capacity of private agricultural service providers. And while the agricultural sector has a huge potential of empowering women in terms of both improving food security and in their income, discrimination against women in this sector has undermined that potential completely. We know that according to Africa Development Bank, women make up more than 50% of the labor in agricultural sector. However, and they produce more than 80% of the food, but they only own between 1% to 5% of the land. So they're not able to control this crucial resource. So commercialization in increasing productivity does not necessarily lead to women's increased incomes. And so if their incomes even increased in agriculture, the women still do not have control over those earnings because they must defer either to their fathers, brothers, husbands, or because of the power dynamics and imbalances between men and women. And of course, this has also been further hampered by the refusal to address issues or the structural issues around land and land ownership in Kenya as per the constitution, which provides for women's land ownership. But of course, there's been resistance to this, including when looking at ancestral lands. So women still continue to operate in exclusion. So the other thing that we also look at is when increased productivity comes, the burden of unpaid care, which is predominantly done by women who must grow that food for commercial and for domestic consumption for their families. It increases the burden for them. That is still not looked at. The debt, or rather the borrowings, don't actually look at the structural inequalities within agriculture. So any borrowings to improve agriculture does not actually end up benefiting women in the long run, and not address the issues of unpaid care. Of course, infrastructure, I think many have spoken about it, but when you look at women, even though we can assume, if we were to assume that the borrowings for infrastructure were actually ideal in terms of benefiting for improvement of physical infrastructure, we look at where those roads lead to. They link either to the factories, to ports, and so are primarily servicing either the needs of huge commercial interests or foreign interests. Not anything to do with women, local production, markets, traders. They are not really, it's not beneficial to them in any way. So the few women who do end up getting employed within the construction projects where we see women in construction, you will find they're doing the lowest paying jobs, such as sweeping, cleaning of roads, waving flags. That is how women have been involved in this. So at the end of the day, much of it is not beneficial to them. When you look at spending on education and healthcare services, which, by the way, is one of the most valuable ways of improving gender equality, because it allows for shared prosperity and increases supply of decent jobs for women, improving our services and reduces women's the disproportionate burden of unpaid care on women. The preference is to incur debt in the physical infrastructure and really not the soft infrastructure. So the potential positive impact of incurring debt does not actually help women in any way, because the government does not seem to see the value of investing in that social infrastructure, healthcare, education, and the like. In fact, when we look at the COVID situation, we've seen, of course, the theft of COVID monies, because the government was able to procure quite significant amounts of loans, some of it grants, but also loans to address the COVID situation, the health impact of COVID. But according to the Ministry of Health, 54% non-compliance in antenatal and postnatal. There was a 54% decrease in compliance in antenatal and postnatal, and at least 50% of the children below the 1 year have not received their immunization. So this in itself is a life-threatening situation and could increase the cost of health in the country significantly. Of course, we have also seen the loss of medical personnel due to infections, lack of protective gear, and those kind of things. So when we look at overall the issue around debt, the country has adopted a very aggressive taxation regimen to try and collect as much revenue as possible to be able to service this debt. However, we're not seeing these resources going towards addressing socioeconomic issues, which primarily affect women. So most of this tax, you're looking at the turnover tax, digital tax, VAT, and this has a negative effect on women, an increase in that, because women use most of their income to pay for consumable products, the fast-moving goods, rice, sugar, milk, school supplies, medicines, sanitary pads. So this revenue goes towards debt repayment, not service delivery, thereby increasing pressures for women. We appreciate very much the work that is being done by TISA and Okoa Uchumi, because one of the biggest problems that we have is that, unfortunately, very few women's rights organizations, if any, actually work on public debt or the wider microeconomic issues as an issue of critical concern to women. And it is imperative that as women, we need to begin to understand how the economy works and begin to participate in issues of how we contract debt and debt repayments and its impact on women's rights issues. So we must actively engage from the stage of debt negotiation to project design and implementation and monitoring and evaluation, much of the work that is being done right now by the Okoa Uchumi. And so, so for us, we're looking at being able to mobilize women to better understand this and hopefully get the women to be able to raise their voice around the debt burden of the country as a gender issue. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daisy. Julius, you're sharing your screen. Okay, I'll request Derek to look into that screen sharing. But thank you, Daisy, for that. I'm sure I have a few questions streaming in and comments. I'll give you a bit of time to address that during the plenary. But I'll move to the next presenter. We have Wilfred Olal presenting on the issue of debts as a social justice issue. Then we are asking, is debt a social justice issue? If so, then how is it a social justice issue, and how can we address this from that perspective? So Wilfred is the convener of the Social Justice Center working groups. Social justice centers, I'm sure we have all from one time or another engaged with the social justice centers. So the working group seeks to promote social justice through engaging the community and social movement platforms. So this is I think, one of the largest social justice movements that we have in Kenya, and they have been doing great work in engaging the citizens at the grassroots on different issues. So Wilfred will be speaking on that topic. I'll give you 5 minutes, Wilfred. Please try to stick to that time because we are doing really badly on time. So welcome.
Asante sana. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
And you can see me also.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to start, I think debt is a social justice issue. And the reason why it is because of most of these loans are borrowed with an objective to address a social need. And it has been very sad that historically, some of these debts have been borrowed to address a certain social need, but they have ended up not addressing those needs, but ending up in the pockets of few individuals. I'll give few examples. One, in the late 1970s, Kenya took a loan to build a fertilizer company called Kenren. And we took a loan of, Jomo Kenyatta took a loan of 350 million shillings. The sad part is that the factory was never built. And imagine how that could have impacted on the farmers of this country, having a local fertilizer company that then you no longer have to import fertilizers. So 30 years later, the final payment of that loan was done last year. And we borrowed 350 million shillings and we ended up paying 6.3 billion shillings without that fertilizer company. And it's very sad that we have government just paying such loans, no investigation on what happened and where the money ended up. So on the issue of agriculture is affected as a sector because we could be having our own fertilizer company. Another aspect of the example of agriculture is the Jubilee when they came in 2017 with their four agendas: one, food security, manufacturing, housing, and affordable healthcare. On the issue of food security, we had the Gulani Kulalu project, the maize project that was addressing the issue of us not borrowing, not getting maize from outside. On that, the project was worth 7 billion. We borrowed, out of the 7, we borrowed 6.3 billion from Israel. From Israel, the project collapsed, as we all know. Now, we don't have the food security. That means Kenya will continue getting food, maize from outside, but we'll continue also paying this loan. So how does that affect our social economic impact? It will mean the price of unga will continue rising. Yet this could have made the price of unga to come down. So it's very sad looking at how these debts are being taken left, right, and center. Right now we are talking about 9 trillion, and how our generations and future generations are going to suffer because they'll continue being taxed taxed, they'll continue paying more taxes, they'll continue suffering. On the issue of manufacturing, most of the companies are closing down. On the issue of housing, the Jubilee Manifesto, 500,000 houses, we haven't seen any. I don't know if they've built any. So we are asking if these are the 4 agendas which Uhuru President Uhuru and Ruto had. Yet we haven't achieved any, but we've increased our debt level to 9 trillion. So it shows that this issue of debt, we have to take it more seriously. And personally, and as a social justice movement, we are also urging our comrades from the sector who are working on issues of debt. One, let us simplify this debt language. You know, this debt language is so technical that most people either run away from or they don't understand anything. And also, we have to start involving the community so that we can have a public campaign on debt, taxation, and illicit financial flows that is run and by the community, so that we don't leave all this advocacy to only the technocrats. And we need a serious anti-corruption campaign against these debts, because most of them end up in people's pockets. And everyone has spoken about public participation. I think it's very, very paramount that public participation in all aspects, including the issue of public debt. Because as we continue, we imagine the Jubilee administration, by the time we're done with two more years, I don't know what will be the debt. Maybe we'll be at 11 trillion. Yet in the ground, core ground, between different, we are not seeing. Right now we have COVID. We look at our public health sector. It's seriously collapsed. So we can see there is no relationship between development and the public borrowing that has been going on. So personally, I think we need to have a serious campaign, but it has to start from the grassroots, where people are first educated and they understand the impact of this debt. Because others, like going to court, we've tried those, the court orders are not respected. But if we come up with a serious campaign that it makes people talk about it across the country, maybe we'll change the narrative of how we do the debt advocacy. Thanks. I'll stop there because of time. Asante sana.
Okay, thank you, Wilfred. That was very brief and has elicited a number of issues, and I think I agree with you. The number of ghost projects that we are funding in this country, money is released, but there are no projects on the ground. So we need citizens to know these things so that they can also follow up and bring these issues to the attention of even the government, or even shout out on these issues. There are no developments. So as you say, there is no correlation between debt and the development that we are seeing, then there must be a connection between debt and something. And I'm really glad that you've spoken before, just before we have Sheila speak on issues of public debt. Then if there's no relation between debt and development, then there must be a relation between maybe debt and corruption. So I think that is a good introduction, and also to bring in the next speaker, Sheila Masinde. Sheila Masinde will be speaking about debt and corruption. Sheila Masinde is the Executive Director of Transparency International Kenya. So Transparency International Kenya is one of the coalition members, and we've been doing quite a number of work on the issues of public debt management and basically public finance management, and particularly speaking on the issue of transparency and accountability. We've done about a number of things calling for transparency and accountability in the public finance management in Kenya. So I'll give Sheila 5 minutes. I know it's a bit of a short time for all the presentations, but in 5 minutes, Sheila, just tell us the relation between debt and corruption and what maybe perhaps we can do to reduce debt and thereby enhance public finance management in our country and reduce public debts, perhaps. Thank you. Karibu. You are on mute, please just unmute.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Irene. Next time, please put me first in the program so that I can have I can go to hog more minutes, but I'll be very brief. And I think as many speakers who have come ahead have alluded, that there's a strong relationship between debt and corruption. And in Kenya, we can say that this relationship is symbiotic. We've seen that debt increases with an increase in corruption. We lose money to theft. I mean, I look at it in this very simple way. We lose money to theft and wastage in spending. Then we have shortfalls in our budget. Then we have to borrow to fill those deficits. And then we register more theft and wastage from the money that we've borrowed. We have more shortfalls. Then we have to borrow to pay what has been borrowed and stolen. So, and by then there's nothing really to show for the money that we have already borrowed. More money is then stolen and wasted. More is borrowed and stolen, and then the cycle then continues. So how do we really stop this cycle? And I think that's one of the things we really must now craft. What strategies do we need to ensure that even if we have to borrow, that money is used in a very transparent manner? I think there are several dimensions that we have to consider when we talk about corruption in public debt or public debt transparency. First of all is really the integrity of the process of procuring debt. And I think a number of the earlier speakers have spoken about some of the issues in terms of the processes even used to acquire debt. And now we're talking a lot more about budgeted corruption, how cost items in budgets are padded. And then we also have questions on what really is fueling the quest for us to seek these loans. Are we really driven by the desire to bring a difference in Kenyans' lives, to bring true development in this country? Or are we just driven by that personal need to be able to line our pockets with money that has been borrowed? That is, and then we must really question what is really driving this huge appetite for loans. And I think sometimes we found ourselves asking, did we really need that money? Did we really need to go out to borrow? Now, the other aspect that we must also look at when you talk about public debt and corruption is that the lack of transparency and accountability in the utility of funds borrowed. I've just tried to define that cycle. You have a shortfall in the budget, or you experience the wastage in spending, you have a budget deficit, then you go out and borrow, that money is then stolen or lost to more wastage, and then that cycle of borrowing continues. But then we have also seen that we also don't really have much accountability in terms of how these funds have been borrowed, and we have really little to show for some of the monies that we've borrowed. I think Olal has just really explained, starting with that Kenren, that Kenren project over 40 years ago. I think we have a lot of the number of projects that we have apparently have been financed by loans in Kenya are quite a number. I think the one that really comes to mind for many people, and I think many speakers have already spoken about it, is SGR. It's a classic example. And I think Shiro in her presentation really raised a lot of questions about the prudence that was applied in the development of SGR and expenditure. There are also questions about the utility of the rail line right now, the viability. Would we ever really recover all the money that has been invested there, yet we continue to pay for it? And we have also noted that there were a number of corruption concerns all through from the conceptualization of SGR, corruption in the procurement process, corruption in the land compensation process. There was also procedural corruption where critical measures like environmental impact assessments were not conducted. I think when the full story of SGR is finally written, I think many of us will be so disappointed in the relevant institutions in place, particularly those supposed to ensure that there's oversight and that there's transparency in public debt management and utilization. I think more recently we borrowed for COVID-19 response efforts. To me, it's still not clear how much was borrowed, what amount was applied where, and whether we even really needed to borrow the money at all. I think at some point we're asking ourselves, okay, so we are borrowing money for COVID-19, but what is a plan or strategy in place You know, have we really thought through, and have we really identified a real need to borrow, or we're just borrowing for the sake of it and giving an opportunity for people to line their pockets? And indeed, in the last 2 months, we've seen that a lot of people ended up enriching themselves through this COVID-19 pandemic. Money that could have been borrowed is now lined in pockets of COVID-19 millionaires through botched procurement processes. And I still believe that EACC is investigating and will be able to see justice in this case and recover all the monies that have been stolen through this. I think speakers have already spoken a lot to the effects of debt and corruption in Kenya. I don't want to go so much, but I think the main concern for us largely has been that because of this kind of corruption, citizens fail to get the deserved services as guaranteed under the Constitution. When you look at Article 43, 53, and 55 of the Bill of Rights, because of inflated service costs. There's also the issue of poor services, lack of value for money. We've talked about the high tax burdens, imposition of new tax obligations on citizens, the turnover tax, the digital tax, and others, because we are now trying to recover money that has been stolen out there, and who gets punished? It's just the ordinary Kenyan. We also need really to assess the role of oversight institutions, like in providing oversight in public debt management, and also what has been their efficacy in executing their mandate. I think we have to look at the role of the Office of the Auditor General, ICJ, Jane of ICJ, Christine, I think I've spoken largely just looking through the Constitution and the provisions in terms of the institutions responsible, like the Office of the Auditor General and its responsibilities as articulated in Article 229 of the Constitution. And I think one of the things we need to do more critically now is possibly just chambua those and end. They had a project, a really exciting project last year on chambuaring the Auditor General's reports. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do. To what extent has the work of the Auditor General and the reports that they then produce been able to pinpoint and confirm whether the money that has been borrowed has been prudently applied and has been fully accounted for and is being used in a lawfully and in an effective manner. So maybe that's an area we may want to invest in. We've also really spoken about the role of Parliament, its role in exercising oversight in contracting debt, in capping the country's debt ceiling, the role of Parliament in the budgetary process. We're now talking about budgeted corruption. Has Parliament helped us to avoid budget padding, including borrowing for ghost projects? And how has Parliament also ensured that we get, full debt information? How much has it been borrowed? What has it been used for? What are those loan conditions that we have committed Kenya to, and so on? And I think the jury is out that we really need to hold Parliament to full account and demand that it fully executes its mandate, because as we see it now, Parliament has not fully executed its mandate, and we need to really work out a strategy to ensure that we demand accountability through Parliament. I think
Sheila, please wrap up. You have
I'm wrapping up, and I'm just going into some of the other proposals that I would recommend moving forward. We clearly need to and of course public participation. I think it is important that citizens are involved in projects which are being funded by money that has been borrowed, and many of us are working on social audits and other social accountability interventions. Maybe it's time to see how we can embed social accountability measures in overseeing some of these projects that are being supported by money that has been borrowed. I think the other critical aspect, and some of the other colleagues, Christine and Jane, have also alluded to this, is access to information. As TIA Kenya, one of the things that we have been advocating for is full debt transparency. Let us get critical information on all aspects of the loans. For instance, who's the lender, the terms and conditions of the transaction, the amount that has been granted, the currency used, the interest rates, what the loan is for, and how is it governed, what's the governing law, what are the immunities, and other critical information. I think we would also want to see technology being applied. And is it even possible to even just have a portal where we have all this information so that Kenyans are then able to appreciate and really track the use of these resources? But I think moving forward, access to information is really key. I think with the kind of debt obligation that we have, and which is rising, because every time the president goes out of the country, the rumor mills go on a spin, that another loan is in the offing. And also considering that there's an almost inseparable relationship between debt and corruption, it is fundamental that we as a country win the fight against corruption to reduce this vicious cycle of borrowing and theft, because this will significantly, I think, reduce the debt burden, as we will then have a better guarantee that borrowed funds will be used to finance sustainable development projects. We'll be able to reduce the national budget and in turn reduce the need to borrow more for development projects. I think the decisions taken by the government in acquiring new debt and how these amounts are spent will have consequences for years to come. I mean, for me, I feel sad that it is so sad that you have a baby who's yet to be born, or a 1-day-old baby who can't even hold a shilling in his palm, but to already think that that baby is already carrying a huge debt burden. I think we must put an end to executive-driven decisions on public debt in the absence of parliamentary involvement and public participation, not just parliamentary involvement, but also the involvement of other oversight institutions. Because if we continue to see this, this will exacerbate the debt crisis and push our debt burden to the brink or beyond. So I think for me, my parting shot is that we really must see how we strengthen the involvement of oversight institutions like Parliament and also amplify public participation, step up oversight for public debt and debt management, and also ensure transparency in how this money, how loans are acquired and how they're utilized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much for that, showing the relation between debt and corruption and some of the things that we need to do and the oversight measures that even we as citizens and CSOs need to also take. So just a bit of housekeeping announcement. I know I should have mentioned this earlier. We are also streaming this meeting live on Facebook and YouTube as well. And please, if you have not followed the Okoa Uchumi page on Twitter, we are at Okoa Uchumi _KE. So please follow us for these and more discussions that we've been having, that we've had before. You can also retrieve. And the hashtag that we've been using and continue to use is Public Debt Crisis KE. So let us continue the discussion even online and on social media platforms, so that we can be able to bring as many people as possible into this conversation to show the effects and also brainstorm on how we can address some of these issues. So we have looked at a lot on the national and regional aspects of public debt in Kenya. We've seen the political dimensions, we've looked at the legal and judicial options available in public debt. We've also looked at the social economic dimension of public debt, how it's affecting the community, how it's affecting women, and also other social justice issues. Olal gave a very precise presentation on how some of these debt issues have gone to debts burden that we are facing has financed non-existent projects. We've seen debt and corruption. Now let us ask ourselves then, what is the global dimension of debt? So I'll bring in John Githongo to discuss the global dimension on debt. John Githongo is the Executive Director of NICC, which works towards building a critical mass of like-minded citizens striving for a better Kenya. So we need to see then what are the dimensions, what are we missing as Kenya that other countries are doing? I know we've had issues of Kenya, we are borrowing in dollars or other currencies, while other countries, especially the Western countries, are borrowing on their own currency, then repayment, the issue of exchange rate does not affect the repayment and such issues, then what are some of maybe even best practices or even worse practices of not to pick that are we looking at from the global perspective? So John, welcome. You have 5 minutes, maximum 7. Please try to stick within the time so that we can be on time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of what I was going to say has already been said by the speakers who spoke before me. And perhaps I'll start by answering the question that you have just asked.
John, allow me to interrupt. Could you please move closer to your microphone? You are a bit further, or speak a bit louder.
Sorry. Is that clearer now?
Yes, better.
Okay, thank you. I think I said I was going to start by answering the question that you asked last, which I think is what do we do now, given the kind of situation that we're in. And I think the kind of initiative that has been launched around acquiring Kenya from debt is exactly the way to go. But to move it from Kenya, because this is an issue that is affecting a whole range of countries, not only across Africa, but Latin America, Asia, and around the world. And this won't be the first time this has been done. It has been done successfully before, where we have a global initiative around debt, especially for the world's poorest countries. And I remember being involved in such a campaign in the 1990s. In 1970, 2% of our public debt, if you take our public debt service as a percentage of exports, it was about 2% in 1970. By 1990, it was 12%. And by 2003, it had gone down to 7%. This is sub-Saharan Africa. However, if you look at external debt, all of it together, which is what you call publicly guaranteed debt, because keep in mind, the government is borrowing money, but so are parastatals, some major parastatals, the Kenya Powers, the Kengens, etc. So we need to consolidate all of that debt as well. And if you take it as a percentage of gross national income, again, in 1970, it was about 16%. In 1995, it was 120%. And in 2003, it had gone down to 60%. Now, what facilitated this was, I'm sure you've heard of the Jubilee campaign, again, on debt, the highly indebted poor countries initiative, which came out of the Jubilee campaign. Jubilee campaign was designed just like what you have designed here with Okoa Kenya from debt, where 33 African countries qualified for having their mainly, it was mainly concessional debt written off. So countries like Ghana, between 1996 and 2006, Ghana's debt to GDP ratio went from 120% to 20%, freeing up a huge amount of resources for spending on health, on education, and other important social aspects. Now, this was a campaign that was pushed very strongly by civil society. They collected 24 million signatures in the West. They pushed the G8 until in 1999, the G8 said, okay, we're going to write off $100 billion of developing of the poorest countries' debt. Even the World Economic Forum recognized, and this is a very conservative neoliberal kind of grouping, recognized that this needed to happen for global business to continue functioning. And so the success of the Jubilee campaign started out of this kind of meeting and this kind of grouping. So what I would say is perhaps we just need to expand. There are others doing this similar kind of work in countries like Mozambique. I was talking to colleagues in Congo Brazzaville, which has got even more serious problems in terms of debt distress. So for me, it's to encourage that we reach out to other actors in civil society in the developing world and also in the developed world to work together to deal with debt, because after the Jubilee campaign lasted from 1996 to 2006, and now in 2020, we're back where we were in 1996. in terms of the debt to GDP ratios. And unfortunately, this time, a large percentage of the debt is commercial. It's not concessional as it was in the 1990s. Just to close, some issues to watch out for and to mitigate as people who are interested in dealing with this issue for Kenya. There's a term that is used, which is this. It's called market fundamentalism. This push that comes whenever we are stuck with the kind of problems we have with debt, of saying that the market will solve it. So KRA has to raise taxes, social spending has to be reduced, especially on health and education and other big spending, etc. And that is something that needs to be challenged. And that challenge is already underway. COVID has created the circumstances where people are beginning to discuss this a lot more seriously, that, you know, this austerity, increasing of taxes, etc., is definitely not the way to go. So I think, you know, they say never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think COVID presents us with that opportunity in dealing with debt. I think the issue of opacity with regard to debt generally has already been raised, so I shall not belabor it. And that opacity is to do with both the Eurobond and the Chinese debt. We talk a lot about the Chinese debt, but, you know, who has seen the different the prospectuses for Eurobond that are issued by the government, signed off by the government, the promises that they make to those who are going to buy our bonds, that we should be able to interrogate these things publicly in advance. The issue of budgeted corruption, which is a form of looting. The last time we saw this was in the 1980s. We call it budgeted corruption. But in the 1980s, Mobutu Sese Seko could call up the Minister of Finance, the Governor of Central Bank, and ask for $25 million because he was going to Switzerland. And that money would be made available to him. Here, we've simply, we've gone to, if you look at the various miscellaneous amendments that have been put out, especially around taxes, if you look at the Gazette notices that you know, change directorships and change the functions of different government agencies, we're also legislating our corruption, rigging the system, as it were. So all this is happening at a unique time, which is where I would end. Because of COVID, it has accelerated trends that were already underway last year. In 2022, the people who are born when Kibaki became president will be voting. And they'll be 56% of the population will be below that age. 75% of the population is below the age of 35. The crisis for them, for this entire demographic, has just begun, and we are beginning to see it have political consequences. Ethiopia been mentioned. The same thing happened in Sudan. You can see what's happening in Nigeria, even as we're talking now, and the same thing is coming here. You know, there is no way out as we go into this quote unquote second wave of COVID. And again, it's how we take advantage of these opportunities to push this agenda, especially of getting rid of the most odious commercial debt that is in our books, and working in partnership with partners who have been very good partners of ours in the first big campaign we had to reduce African debt. They are still there. They focus now a lot more on dealing with odious debt, which is bought by vulture funds, and then they try to auction the assets of poor countries like Zambia and Malawi to recover these funds. But to reach out to them, and I think they'll be very happy to participate in this kind of teleconference, so that we can form a global united group, united in confronting the debt issue and mitigating and rejecting this market fundamentalism that is imposed on us. That, okay, that if you have debt, you need to pay it. This is the interest. Increase your taxes. Tax even the poorest people, while not acknowledging that a lot of the resources that have been borrowed have actually been looted by a very small elite. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was a good illustration on what the global dimension of debt looks like. And I think we have a lot of lessons to borrow globally. And also I like the idea that we need to enhance partnership even at the global level, regional and global level, to be able to effectively advocate for the issue, against the issue of the rising public debt, and also on the use of this debt, the borrowed money. Transparency and accountability is also key in addressing this. So I'll just move to the last speaker under this session, and I still remember I have another speaker to bring on, Roman. I hope he will be able to speak in like 3 minutes after we've heard about the debt options that are there for Kenya. So we'll have Okoa Uchumi talk about the debt options that are available for Kenya. And perhaps I'll just start him off with Kenya. We refuse to seek the debt relief under the G20 initiative. I don't know, was that a bold move? Was that a move that brought us or could have saved a bit of our economy, and we did not take it? And on top of that, then what are other options that are available, debt options that are available for Kenya? So Okoa Uchumi is the Chief Executive Officer of the IEA. IEA is the Institute of Economic Affairs. Basically, it's a think tank that provides platform and inform the discussions in order to influence public policy in Kenya. So he'll be telling us more about what options are there for us as a country as we try to battle this issue of public debt, the rising public debt. Kwame, please go. You have 5 minutes, maximum 7. Please try to stick to that.
No, it's okay. I'll stick to that. Please let me know when my 5 minutes are over. I'll just shut up after that. I'll mention 3 points, but let me start with as we discuss policy options, one of the things we need to ask ourselves, and I think it's important for that in the brief that Okoa Uchumi campaign provided, to define probably what's a public debt problem. And I'm afraid we Kenyans are not defining properly what the public debt problem in Kenya is. We know what the public debt position is. It's bad. And many of us also said in this discussion that we might get into debt distress. Not might. We've been in debt distress for 3 years, people. So getting those facts right is also important. If you define technically debt distress for what it is, we've been here for 3 years. But let me say what is a public debt problem and then talk about the options very quickly before my 5 minutes are over. The public debt problem in Kenya is a spending problem. It is not a problem that Kenya does not have sufficient taxes. So let me give you an example. I mean, many people dispute it, but now, in the year just before the First World War, between the First World War and the Second World War, so we are talking here about the 1920s, this country known as Germany and the United States were above our income level today. So their income levels were above, Kenya's income level today is about $2,100 on a nominal basis. Basically, that's an income per person per year. Their debt to GDP ratio at that time was between 9 and 11%. Kenya's debt to GDP, their revenue to GDP ratio was 9 for the US and 11 for Germany. For Kenya, last year, debt to GDP rate, spending, revenues to GDP ratio, I'm talking about spending first, is almost 2.5 times that. I want us to know clearly that if you're going to discuss and actually create public education about what to be done about debt, we need to understand what the problem is. Kenya's debt problem, Kenya's public debt problem comes from the spending side, not the revenue side. My view is that this country is probably collecting as much revenue as you can collect from the poor people in this country. So that's the reason I am reluctant to support, and I think John has mentioned this, the view that all we need to do is raise taxes on those rich people. There are not too many rich people in Kenya as well. Of course, there are many thieves as well, but there are not too many rich people for which the debt solution can come from higher taxes. So we have to be cautious about that solution. I don't want to flog that point to death, but if it's the only thing you remember about what I said, please do. Because solutions have to be based on a proper diagnosis of what the problem in Kenya is. So let's take that. Now, if we go back there, let's come about to this, to what are the policy options that we as civil society groups should coalesce around. I think the first thing that we see is, I also think that Kenya doesn't lack institutional tools for dealing with what the public debt problem in Kenya is. It is just that the institutions in terms of rules and the organizations in terms of those bearing responsibilities are not doing it. And Kenya's public debt problem lies squarely in the problem between in accountability on the part of Parliament, which went to sleep, and the Treasury, which knows very, very well how Parliament is activated. We have a Parliament in Kenya that believes that a big that a big budget is by itself a good thing, and therefore escalates. Now, what that happens is because they have figured out 2.5%, which they figured out, I think, unconstitutionally, money that is spent on CDF, they have an interest necessarily in a big spending. And what then the Treasury does, or let me say the executive does, is trap them by saying, look, this is what we need, because then they all calculate 2.5% of a bigger sum. So they have an incentive that is perverse to managing the debt and managing public finance. So that's the thing we need to, so we need to ask ourselves, within the public finance management cycle, how do we strengthen how money is raised, whether through debt or through taxes, all the way to the spending and the audit? And that's the infrastructure that we actually need to politically analyze and understand how to make those institutions do their work well. And we have, as citizens, to get Parliament out of its addiction for heavy spending as an end in itself. So that's the issue, because otherwise, there's no country that can raise enough money if you have a government that's prepared to run a deficit every single year. You will never raise enough money, and a debt crisis will always be something to face you. So that's basically the thing. So how do we strengthen the public finance management cycle? Now, the part of that, of course, is Parliament itself, which understands through the Constitution, and if you read Article 2, the entire Chapter 12 of the Constitution, there's no spending, there's no debt that is done without Parliament having approval. Now, there are laws that are required for Parliament to actually state, or there are required rituals for Parliament and processes for Parliament to declare every single year how much money it is spending, rather for the Treasury to put before Parliament all the details that all of us are lamenting about here. Who do we owe, on what terms? What does that reflect? Parliament just never calls for them. So in a way, I think there's a dance that Parliament and the national executive through the Treasury have, which is very comfortable. And it's upon us as citizens to understand how to break that by creating the creative tension that is required for Parliament to begin to be a proper check, and for the executive through the Treasury to behave well in terms of disclosures. The data is always available. It's just a question of who do we owe and at what terms. So that's the first thing. Now, the other option, obviously, is to ask ourselves as citizens as well, what do we know? Look, guys, the SGR is a story that makes me sad, not only because it was the biggest investment, but the truth is the SGR, when it was first started and when the program was going on, it was a very popular program. Kenyans actually believed that a nice, shiny train was a good thing. The turn simply took place after 2017. And that worries me because it also shows that as civil society groups, either we did not understand it sufficiently well, the risks that it posed, and if we did not understand the risks sufficiently, then we failed to convince the public and then got us into this problem. I don't think there's an option, especially because the government of Kenya, even in the Chinese loans, some of those are not to the Chinese state. They are state corporations and banks, which are considered commercial entities in other ways. So understanding that basket of Kenya's debt and how it posed a risk, I think is an issue that we need to also consider. So my view is, how do we put Parliament back on the back foot and ask Parliament, look, you need to do your job to control spending, which is the way you control deficits, because deficits are just basically spending today and throwing the burden into the future. So as I conclude, the problem is a spending problem. So as people who work in civil society, and we must defend the economic, social rights of Kenyans, we must not sell to them the idea that every single problem in Kenya can be solved by government spending more money. So that's the first. The second is we need a very robust discussion with Parliament and have them take responsibility. I know the executive is out there, have them take responsibility for the fact that they watched or they slept as the country was driven into deficits that are unimaginable, and that the problem is already here, and we can see in terms of the government's inability to respond flexibly to problems such as COVID. And so the final thing is, as members of people in civil society, there are no technical fixes to what the debt will. Debts have to be paid for. And as you remember, the commercial debts, especially in the Eurobond, have a very interesting clause, which Parliament should have covered. And the clause says that if government of Kenya seeks any relief in terms of debt, then it will be considered a defaulter for the purposes of the Eurobond. Now look at that. That if you consider relief or try to stretch your debts, then you'll be in default. So basically, that is such a bad debt to sign that only reckless people could have signed it. And it happened right under the noses of Parliament. So it's whether every time the Treasury came up and sought to raise the debt ceilings, Parliament gave it, without doubt. I mean, unanimously. So I think they cannot escape responsibility. So the point for us is, how do we deal politically with placing them under pressure? But the second point is, we must be involved throughout the budget cycle and ask, as government is buying laptops for kids, as it's buying bridges to anywhere else, as it's buying this nice shiny train, what does that mean for the debt position? And more importantly, what does that mean for the fact that in the future, when this debt has to be paid for, we will have to forgo certain public services that we're all interested in. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kwame. That was within time and precise. And I think I agree that we need to be vigilant and do our part as civil society organizations to involve the citizens on the issues that are at hand, for them to effectively call for accountability for these funds that we are talking about right here. So before, I had forgotten, Waluguru, is Roman ready to just, in 3 minutes, to just tell us about the examples of debt and its impact in the community under the Okoa Uchumi? So if Roman is ready, please just in 3 minutes, and then we move to discussing the plenary. I have a number of questions and discussions. Roman, please go.
Hello?
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Mnanipata?
Tunakupata kabisa.
Hello? Yeah, mimi nitazungumza kwa Kiswahili kwa sababu pia nyenyangu ni digital na anasikiza hii. Kwa hivyo nilikuwa nataka niongee kwa lugha ambao hata wale ambao nawakilisha pia nao watasikia. Nafikiri mnatumai mnanipata. Hello?
Tunakupata Roman, tafadhali endelea.
Yeah, sasa kwa kusema ukweli, tangu huu mradi wa SGR uanzishwe umeumiza watu wengi sana. Kutokana na ile research ambayo tumefanya juzi, tumekuta kwamba zile petrol station ambazo zilikuwa zina uwezo wa kuajiri watu 80 ama watu 200, siku hizi tu zinaweza kuajiri watu 20 peke yake. Okay, tukirudi sasa kwa upande wa mafundi, tumefanya uchunguzi na tukakuta kwamba ni mafundi wengi sana ambao wamepoteza kazi, pamoja na madereva wa masafa marefu, pamoja na wenye manyumba. Wenye manyumba wamepoteza wateja, na kwa sababu hili jambo lilifanyika kinyume cha sheria, halikushirikisha wananchi wenyewe. Kuna wale ambao walikuwa wameomba loan ili waweze kuboresha biashara zao. Lakini sasa kutokana na huu mradi ambao ulikuja bila watu kujulishwa, basi mambo tayari yakaanza kubadilika. Hivi sasa tunavyozungumza na nyinyi, nafaka ambayo ni grain ilikuwa inapakiliwa na gari hapa Mombasa, nayo pia imebadilishwa, sasa wanapakia Nairobi. Sasa wamechukua container pamoja na nafaka, ambapo imeacha watu wengi sana katika mji wa Mombasa bila kazi. Hata hivi tunavyozungumza, kumeongezeka walofa. Mji wa Mombasa ulikuwa haulali watu wengi katika vichochoro, lakini sasa ukipita kwa vichochoro utakuta watu wengi sana wamelala katika vichochoro, na hii ni kutokana na ukosefu wa kazi. Na hii hata inaweza kudhihirika. Kuna tajiri ambaye anagawanya chakula kila Jumatano na Ijumaa, anagawanyia zaidi ya watu 30,000. Hii ni kutokana na umaskini ambao umeletwa na serikali, kutokana kwamba wamechukua rasilimali kutoka mji wa Mombasa na wakazipeleka katika mji mwingine. Ni kutokana na hali hii ambapo watu wa Mombasa waliona kwamba hii haistahili na wakaanza kuungana ili kufanya maandamano kupinga huo uovu. Basi watu walifanya maandamano, lakini serikali ilijibu kwa njia nyingine. Watu walikuwa wanawekwa ndani, unashikwa, unawekwa ndani, unasingiziwa kosa ambalo hukufanya, lakini hivyo hivyo watu wakaendelea kudai haki yao. Ni hivi juzi tu kutokana na COVID-19 ambapo watu wamezuia kidogo kuendelea na maandamano, lakini tuko na imani baada ya COVID-19 bado tutaendelea na maandamano kupitia kwa muungano wetu wa Okoa Mombasa, tukiwa na chama cha Dock Workers na Kenya Long Distance. Hili deni kwa kweli limetuumiza sana. Watu wengi wamekosa kazi, watu wengi tu. Ukija Mombasa wewe utashangaa, ile iliyokuwa inaitwa Mombasa raha sasa sio raha, bali ni masikitiko kutokana na ile dhuluma ambayo serikali kuu imetendea watu wa Mombasa. Basi ni kutokana na hayo, sitaongea sana kwa sababu muda wangu ilikuwa ni dakika 3 peke yake. Shukrani.
Asante sana Roman kwa kutueleza baadhi ya some of the effects that are being felt due to the issues of public debt, and we've seen he's also mentioned about how poverty continues to be a big issue, and businesses also being affected. And we've seen some of the speakers highlighted the rising or the increase in taxes and the tax base just to be able to cover or to be able to pay the debts that we have incurred in the past due to development projects or other other aspects of development, and also to be able to fill the deficit gap in our budget that has always, year in, year out, we have very big budget deficits that we need to fill, and that has been part of that financing. So I have a number of questions addressed to different panelists. So I'm glad some of the panelists have already addressed the questions, some questions in the chat. So I'll just highlight some of the questions that I have here, and any panelist can pick any of them and answer or speak to them. So we had first the issue of debt, let me say debt and BBI. Then this fear that the BBI agenda will overshadow some of the important discussions or agendas like public debt or discussing public debt. So Peter asks if we could use this space, or if this space can be used, the BBI issue can be used to magnify the agenda on debt, or whether we can ride on the same. And if it comes to that, then is there space to actually speak on issues of public debt, despite having now a national ongoing agenda on building bridges initiative? And then we have we also have another question on youth. If Kenya is over 60% of youth under CSOs deliberate on youthful and in our communication and advocacy, then how do we engage? Perhaps the question would be then, how do we engage youth, even in our social justice centers and other groups, to be able to speak more on this issue and emphasize the voices of this? Sorry, Roman, please mute.
Thank you.
Okay, so Julius also asked whether we have a comprehensive detailed list on projects that the total debts in Kenya has maybe funded, I think, and can the list be tabled in this forum? So I think this is a question addressed more to the coalition members, and whether we can have this list available for viewing, and also to be able to interrogate some of the issues that arise and the amounts also. And someone also asked whether there are any valid CSO pro-debt arguments, even if they are not presented in this forum, or is the CSO sector generally in consensus of the matter of debt? I think just touch a bit on this, and also I'm sure some of the speakers will also touch on it. I don't think debt in itself is a bad thing. It's how it's used, and some of the issues, accountability and transparency issues that come about after that, then it causes us in the next budgeting cycle, then we have to borrow more because we were not able to finance the projects that we wanted to finance in the past borrowing cycle. Then we have to borrow more and more. It's the consequences of debt that for me are a problem. But borrowing itself, I think, I'm not sure if there's a government that survives or works without debt, just out of its own domestically sourced revenue. And I think we also need to enhance our domestic resource mobilization efforts and look at how other sources of revenue that you can use apart from debt, so that we can be able to also reduce the amount of debt that we seek in to finance our budget. So another question was Lucy asked on the issue of SGR, and I think Sheila has touched on this. And also just to mention that the Okoa Uchumi members are also looking into this, the SGR case. Perhaps Sheila or sorry, Wanjiru can speak more on that. We have a question from Evelyn asking if she wanted to find out, or to her, the issue of unborn child being already in debt is interesting. And she wanted to find out if this is a justified point on sharing the constitutional issue on sharing revenue, equitably sharing debt burden amongst generation or between generations. There's a question for John Githongo. Peter asked whether he could comment on the emerging movement towards bilateral debt, particularly with changing global dynamics, that is the greater disintegration and challenges against multilateralism. And he thinks that this will be a greater challenge when it comes to debt campaign at the international level, at the global level, that is. And then there's also a question on who is responsible for the debt mess that we are in. I think this is quite an interesting one. I'd also like to hear about it. It's like when you ask who is responsible for the illicit financial flow, or who do we ask about illicit financial flows that we are facing, problem that we are facing. So the same also is asked about debt, who is responsible. And I think Kwame mentioned this, that it's a spending problem rather than an acquiring problem. Like we do not, it's about the spending, it's on the spending aspect of it, but he also goes further to ask whether it's an individual or political or collective also a problem that we have gotten ourselves into, and the ultimate responsibility for a perceived social issue should be also appreciated. I have a question from Rosemary asking whether with the current borrowing trends and how that we are seeing in the country, how soon are we likely to hit the debt limit of 9 trillion that has been set? And is there something that the citizenry can do to this effect or to avert this? We saw Parliament as an oversight bodies, and among the role of it, of Parliament, is to set the national debt ceiling, and right now we are sitting at 9 trillion. Then what happens if we get there? Will Parliament simply just raise the ceiling or interrogate some of the issues or questions as to why we are there in the first place, and also maybe put a stop to spending? I don't know, what are the options, or how can we address that? So those are the questions that I have so far. Any panelists can go, but there's a request that John Githongo needs to leave, so I'll ask him to address questions that have been, that he can, just before he leaves. So I'll ask him to go first, and then we have other speakers come next, addressing any of the questions. And if I need to clarify any of the questions, please just let me know, but they're on the chat. You can just pick them from there. So John?
Thanks. No, I mean, I think it's an excellent question. This move towards bilateral agreements, and in Kenya's case, we're talking very specifically about the discussions that the Kenya government, negotiations that have been embarked upon by the Kenya government with the US government. to come up with a bilateral trade agreement. And if you look at the details, some of them would have a very negative impact, not only on the Kenyan economy, but in our participation in regional bodies and in the continent at large. The same thing is happening with regard to the United Kingdom, where, with Britain, who are going into Brexit, so they're exiting the European Union, and therefore are, seem to have targeted Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria for bilateral arrangements, which I think will have a similar negative effect. And I think I know it was mentioned earlier, this idea of creating Nairobi into an international financial center is partly driven by these moves that are happening outside Kenya, but are finding expression here. I think it's unfortunate, just at the time when Africa is talking of and working towards an African free trade area, which is essential for us to be able to engage with new, big, powerful, aggressive players on the world stage. And, as the US is retreating, Britain is retreating, we are seeing, China, Russia, Turkey, India, etc. And we need to be able to be interlocutors with them with some leverage, and that leverage can only be found if we as Africans work together. So it's very sad for me to see that. I mean, Kenya has long been dismissed as the Uncle Tom of Africa. We had relations with apartheid era South Africa. We didn't support the ANC when others did in the same kind of robust way. And here again, just when Africa is talking about an African free trade area, Kenya walks off and says we're going to do a deal with the US, another one with the UK. I think it won't end well for us. I think that, as I said, the defining political, economic reality for Africa for the next 20 years is our demographics. The majority of our population is below the age of 35. Uganda has the youngest population in the world. And the moves being made by the elite, which are bilateral, that serve their own very personalized commercial interests, are very much, they are very much in opposition to the aspirations and the kind of policies that would be necessary to deliver to this huge demographic of young Africans who we should be making it possible. Kenya has an excess of university graduates. We should be making it easy and possible for them to be able to move, to travel, to get jobs around the continent. That is where we should be focusing our energy. Making a deal with the US now will have some short-term benefits, but in the long term undermines us as a country, but also as undermines us in a very fundamental identity basis as Africans when the rest of the continent is going in a different direction. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there a question that I left out?
No, but let me just add one of my own. And also, I think it was raised as a point here of discussion. We say that, or given different dimensions or how we look at debt in Kenya, then for some countries or international organizations or institutions say that Kenya is, at what time we are not in a debt crisis, our debt is sustainable, and in the next minute we see that we are our debt sustainability level are too low. Then now our status has moved at a certain level. Then where do we stand? Why is it so drastic a move that at 1 minute we are okay, we are sustainable, and in the next minute we are doing really badly? Then how do we reconcile? Then it will also help even in our advocacy efforts to know what exactly is the stand. Are we doing badly or are we within sustainable measures?
I think, we're in a position now in 2020 that we weren't in the 1990s, where people like Kwame Owino here, we have a whole raft of experienced, knowledgeable, globalized Kenyans who can engage around this issue. We sometimes, and I think too often, take the IMF, World Bank too seriously. Yet they have been complicit. And I say that, without fear of contradiction. They have been complicit as we have accumulated this debt. And I'll just ask you to go to the IMF website and see the letters. Whenever an IMF mission comes to Kenya, they write a letter about the conversations that they had with our different ministers, and they comment on the status of our debt, or the economy, etc. And one can see that they're flip-flopping around or using very woolly language to describe a crisis that started some time ago. So what I would be calling for is that, let's listen more to the IEAs than the IMFs for once. Part of the reason we're in the crisis that we are in is because of IMF programs that we implemented in the 1990s. So I think it's for us also as Africans to grab our own destiny into our own hands, and also accept that we have the knowledge and capacity within ourselves to be able to analyze these problems and come up with solutions. The most we are going to get, sorry to say, out of our IMF and World Bank friends, very clever guys who sometimes do very dumb things.
Okay, thank you. I think I don't have any from me, and I think you've addressed the question that was raised to you. So if you have to leave, then I think you can, but other speakers that are here will also address questions that maybe were meant for you, and you're unavailable. So
I'm here for another, I'm here until 12, so it's fine.
Okay. I think we'll be done with the plenary. So any other speaker wants to take any other question?
Yes, can I say something?
Okay, please go. But just before you go, I see a comment or question from Lucy saying, in her view, Kwame nailed it. So how do we take the conversation in that direction? So as you address some of the questions, then also touch a bit on Lucy's comment.
Actually, it's Lucy's comment that I was going to comment on. I was going to answer. So this is it. My view is that let's take responsibility as Kenyans and ask ourselves, how do we make sure that the question of public debt is printed in the minds of the people who make decisions? And the IEA had a discussion before on this about 2 years ago. We were not able to raise the resources, or we couldn't think about it clearly. For us at the IEA, actually, the public debt problem, and as John mentioned, regardless of what the IMF at the World Bank do, and as he said, they have smart people who sometimes make decisions that can actually shock you. But the point is, we as Kenyans who live here know, and we can feel, just like we all know that even with COVID and all these other things, the economy was already very soft and we were not doing too well. So regardless of the fact that the government tries to blame COVID for everything else, we know that that's not the whole truth. So what do we do? Look, if it was entirely up to me, I will tell you something that once I read somewhere, which is a good thing. We need something that we should call a public debt clock, where all of us as civil society actors come together and put a digital clock that's running in the public square somewhere in Nairobi and the major cities, showing you in real time how much money is owed by the public sector and how it moves in real time in terms of the interest that is earned. That will do two things. It concentrates minds, but the most important thing is we force Parliament and parliamentarians to confront the issue. Because I can tell you that if you ask some parliamentarians today, well, let me just say with respect, even as government reports today that the public debt is actually about 7.2, closer to 7 trillion, I actually think it's higher than 7 trillion. Because of the same questions that John mentioned. John mentioned that in addition to just the debt that is declared, there are a lot of other contingent liabilities related to Kenya Airways, related to KPLC, related to KenGen and all those others, which are actually guaranteed by the public sector. And when those debts come due, they'll actually fall as part of public debt. So whether we define them as public debt or not, the obligation that the Kenyan taxpayer bears to pay a lot of, some money that some people are spending in the public sector is there, regardless of whether we call it debt. So that's the first thing that we need to, in my view, we need to bear in mind. But the second is, I think, let me just say that the Okoa Uchumi campaign needs to think very clearly about what's the game plan? Because in my view, the crisis is here. The point is just how we offer solutions that deal with the crisis. So we are not preventing it, it's already here. So we are dealing with the treatment, we are not dealing with the prevention. And so our language and our discourse must be with prevention. So for instance, I was a bit disappointed, to be honest. You all remember 6 months ago, when Parliament sought to, the National Assembly rather, sought to put together a committee, a subcommittee on national debt, and the Speaker, for whatever reasons that did not satisfy us at the Institute of Economic Affairs, said that that issue will be dealt with as a budget committee issue. I disagree. The public debt right now is the enduring public finance management problem in Kenya, and it's actually a reflection that that public finance management has been poor. Parliament needs to fix its eyes permanently on the question of public debt. So I don't know how we get it back, but even if we don't, maybe we need representation to ask Parliament to, on a regular basis, ask the Cabinet Secretary to provide reports, giving us medium term, but also regular reports, so that it shouldn't be like an annual one, as happens. It should actually be more regular reports about what the public debt position in Kenya is, and then we start discourses around that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kwame. May I request that you also address Rosemary's question? She asked, with the current borrowing and trends, how soon are we likely to hit that limit that has been set? And is there something that we can do, especially the how soon that we are likely to meet it, to hit, sorry, the limit? I know you say we are already there, but rough projections.
Okay, well, the public debt limit is 9 trillion. And if you remember, one of the things that, again, remember before that, it used to be a ratio, which was, I think, 60% of GDP. It was 55, then it was raised to 60% of GDP, and then it was raised to 9 trillion. Our view actually is the better measure of it should actually be not an amount, a nominal amount, but actually a share, so that you know how far we have come over a long time, because the base of the economy also grows. So I'm not too worried about 9 trillion, which I think will reach before this administration, the Jubilee administration, is done. And of course, they'll also argue that the economy will have been bigger in that time, so it will be a lower share, which means they're taking us back to the measure that they changed. So I'm not too sure why, but I think it will. And it's inevitable. Let me say why it's inevitable. There are a lot of big obligations that are coming for payments. Like you all know, there was a big payment, tranche payment this year. I mean, at the end of last year for one of the Eurobonds, and this year for the first tranche, I mean, the principal for the Chinese debt. So a few more are coming in the next, I think, 12 months, 10 months. And if that happens, obviously, there will need one big payment to be made, I think about 50 billion on that ago. With the effects of COVID together with the global problem, obviously, I think revenues will be short. For that reason, government will need. So what government should do, inevitably, is actually to stretch the tenure of debt. The problem with Kenya's debt is not just that it was big. The problem is that government was borrowing short-term money. So when President Kibaki was president, the average debt of Kenya, all the average, if you put the debt together, the average tenure, which is the period of payments, was about 27, 26 years. The Jubilee administration, in its first 4 years alone, brought it down to 19. So the amount of debt went up, but also the period in which you have to pay it went down. So that's why the debt stress actually started. So it's not just about the size, it's also the period in which you have to pay. So it's, for instance, if I owed 1,000 shillings and I have to pay 1,000 shillings in 2 days, it's very different from owing the same money and you have a month, right? Because one is more stressful than the other. So this administration reduced the tenure, but also increased the quantum, which is why there's this pressure that we see. So I think it's inevitable that some debt tenure will have to be stretched. How it is managed is one of the things that Parliament can actually force a conversation with the Cabinet Secretary on, and I hope they do that. And let's also put them under pressure to actually do that. But let's ask Parliament, every parliamentarian, you know, whether through social media or personal engagement or through the committees, what is your committee doing? And it's not just the finance committee, every committee, even the committee on agriculture, the committee on health. Part of the reason the public health response to COVID was as tame or not as quick was because there's no cash. So the public debt consequences are already here and we can see it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kwame. Another speaker who wants to address a question or comment that has been raised. If I need to go through the question again, just let me know.
Irene, maybe just to, there are two questions or three, just alluding to the BBI process. I think one from Peter and another one from Lucy, not Lucy Githaiga, the other Lucy. And I think their question was whether we can ride on the BBI wave just to seek any concessions or any remedies on this, on the public debt issue. I think there are questions about the legitimacy first on BBI. You know, is it really a people-driven process? And what are really the aims and objectives of BBI? And so we may really want to think critically, even if it becomes a public, you know, it becomes a huge wave and so on. I think for me, my question goes back to just the fundamental foundational principles behind BBI. And because one of the things we need to do as Okoa Uchumi is just really drive citizens towards agitating for public debt transparency and being more involved in public finance issues. But for me, I don't know whether BBI will cut it. And I think this is a tongue-in-cheek comment. I don't know that BBI will be the ship that will rescue us or will sink us further into public debt given the costs entailed. But anyway, that's just my thought on BBI, because I think someone was saying that we're trying to evade the BBI discussions, but those are my own personal thoughts based on the legitimacy of the process. I think there was another question, but Kwame has really tackled it well in terms of how do we avoid, I think it's a question by Rosemary, on the issue around given the borrowing trends and we're likely to hit the debt limit of 9 trillion. For me, I would just say, I think between now, from now, what we need to do, and I think this is one of the things as Okoa Uchumi really need to buckle down to, is just start getting a critical mass of actors. And I think now
Hello. Back. Wow, on the program, there were some questions that had been raised. So any of the speakers can kindly field give the answers kindly. Sheila, had you completed? Okay, please bear with us as we reorganize. I think we had just a power fluctuation. Okay. Just step, and I'm not sure how far we had gone on the questions.
10, I am back, sorry.
But because I'm a part, oh, Irene, I can see your back.
Yes, 10, I am back. Sorry, we had a bit of pause, and so.
Where were we on? Right. So do we go to the reading of the statement, the question, the Q&A?
I wanted to give a few other speakers a minute each to just comment on some of the questions that have been raised. We have, most of them have been addressed. So if a speaker has a question or has seen a question that they want to maybe speak just a few seconds, please proceed. I know Sheila was cut off, but I think she was just at her conclusion. Yes, Jen.
Okay, thank you, Irene. I think as we wait for Sheila, I just wanted to comment on a question by, I think it was Evelyn, on the issue of intergenerational equity and whether it's justiciable. And I think it is because I think the issue is that we have seen it mostly in environmental law matters because of there is the constant, I feel like most people associate sustainability with the environment, but really it is also a key issue in the context of the use of resources and the burdens of future and current generations. So I think for the same rationale that we use it in environmental matters, it is still applicable even in accumulation of public debt. And I think it's actually something courts will most likely consider as we discuss issues of public debt. I think other than that, the other questions were addressed. Thank you, Irene.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jen. I see Leonard is on.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate the point I was making at the conclusion of my presentation about civic education. And Olal has actually pointed out to this. We as civil society really need to rethink this. While we are engaged in capacity building, that question of civic education is very important, because when you think about the prominence of public finance management in the conversations that we are having and the need to link up and put pressure on parliament, we can't do this without the wider citizenry. And as civil society, we are at risk of, or probably we are already estranged from the citizenry in articulating their needs in this whole conversation. And that is something that we should really give a lot of significance to as we proceed in this endeavor. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Leonard. I'll just bring in Irene Otieno on an issue that had been raised earlier by Lucy. And to add on it, I just wanted on political issues during her presentation, I just wanted to add a question of my own on the role of the Public Debt Management Office in Kenya. Is the office independent in itself, and is it meant to be independent from the National Treasury? And what are some of the roles that it executes? Because when you look or ask on some of the information on public debt to the Public Debt Management Office, they send you to maybe the Parliament or National Treasury. So is there an overlapping role, or should that office be independent of the National Treasury, or are they meant to complement each other? Irene? Is Irene Otieno still on the call? Okay, maybe she is not, because I can't see her here. Perhaps we can have any other just 1 minute for any other speaker who would like to say something, and then I'll give the floor to Wanjiru for the presentation of the Okoa Uchumi demand. So any speaker, you have 1 minute to just say something, and then we move to the next part of the program. And okay, if there is none, I think Wanjiru, I'll give you the floor on to make the presentation on the Okoa Uchumi Manifesto and demands. Just what, as the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, are we asking, or are we looking into, and what are some of the demands that we are asking in relation to the question of public debt? And just before you start, Wanjiru, just for a minute, I'll give Sheila the floor to finalize her comment. I know she was cut off by the power outage. Sheila was, she was making a comment on Rosemary's question that has also been addressed by Kwame. Sheila?
Hi, sorry, Irene, I got cut off by a power outage here. I think what I was trying to address was just on the individual culpability. I think we have seen that there have been violations because there's a question, I don't think it was Rosemary's question, I can't remember whose it was, but there's a question around who we need to hold ultimately accountable. And because, I mean, there's a whole, there are a number of institutions that have, you know, let the guard down. We've talked about the role of Parliament. But for me, I think that we need to possibly just look at individual public officers. But like in the case of SGR, I know that there was an argument around, you know, can we even look at the culpability, individual culpability of some of these officers who breached the procurement laws, as was found by the Court of Appeal. And maybe one of the things we need to also consider, perhaps as civil society, as a coalition, as public-spirited Kenyans, is what options do we have legally? For instance, can we institute civil proceedings against individuals who have been found culpable in breaching the public finance management laws, and thus worsened and driven us towards the debt crisis that we are in today? So maybe that's something else perhaps we want to also consider as we look at options just to get remedies, to get to seek redress moving on, and so that Kenyans then can be able to claim justice against this issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. Wanjiru, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Irene. And thank you so much to all the speakers. And I'll read this and I'll ask Sheila to kindly stay on. I had hoped, we have a number of coalition partners. They were mentioned at the outset, but I noticed that they've left. So I'll read, and then Sheila, I request you read the final set of demands. This is, like I mentioned earlier, we have a couple of papers that we will be publishing. But in the meantime, we will send some of the demands that we have. What I've captured here are part of the reflections from today. Of course, we'll listen more keenly to this recording and glean out what has been shared with us in terms of strategy. It has been extremely illuminating for us because really we are dealing with a case of impunity, abject impunity, and we need strategies to deal with that. I would like to thank all of you, all the speakers for their inputs. So whereas this is a civil society agenda and a statement from today's meeting, whereas the Constitution provides the principles for public finance management to safeguard public resources and enable citizens live a life of dignity, we note that the development priorities of the present administration have moved the country from a stable debt position to a debt crisis in less than 7 years, where public participation is a key underlying pillar of the Constitution. Citizens have been sidelined in public debt management discussions, resulting in ballooning debt, secrecy, allowing corruption to mushroom. And whereas the Constitution calls for competent, ethical leaders of high integrity who work in the public interest, this has not happened. Cabinet is behaving like a rubber stamp, and Parliament has failed to exercise its oversight role in violation of their oath of office. And whereas the Constitution and principles of natural justice require that the burdens of taxation and debt should be borne fairly, we see that the poor are bearing the brunt of debt repayments. Whereas Article 43 of the Constitution guarantees socio-economic rights to every citizen. On the subject of debt relief, we call on government to take advantage of available debt relief options. And advocate for debt relief, Ethiopia and the rest are doing. We call for governments of the economy that have been ravaged by COVID, including those who have lost their jobs, businesses, and those working in informal sector. We call for the ring fencing of emergency funding to be directed towards improving social needs and boosting equitable growth to the benefit of ordinary citizens. We call for government to get rid of odious commercial debt and for civil society to do our part in making this a reality. On the matter of fiscal consolidation, we note that the development budget is one of the primary factors driving debt. We therefore call on government to slow down investment in expensive, large infrastructure projects which are necessary at a time of crisis such as this. We call for a review of tax breaks, exemptions, and incentives given to foreign companies which are being used and may be used for tax avoidance. We call for a merging, scrapping, and where necessary, privatizing of resource-consuming parastatals and state corporations to reduce waste and we widen the tax base, tax people more, and ignores the needs of the young, the poor, and the marginalized, and the middle class who are bearing the brunt of taxation, of heavy taxation, without commensurate benefits. Government, we note that government has failed to comply with court orders on transparency and accountability in debt financing. And they have failed to publish contracts involving commercial debt, failed to make these public. We note that Treasury yet has failed to comply with Parliament's directive on transparency around debt projects. Civil society, we need to push government, the CS, Treasury, parliamentary committees to buy public debt and their performance status. We note that advocacy is not working. The usual avenues of petition, missions are not working around debt and get the community on board. We need to start at the grassroots, educate the public on the impacts of debt. There is a need to audit existing loans because many of them the books there are no benefits to Kenya. We need to, and especially where these acts and the consequences of these acts need to be borne by office holders as a way of dealing with impunity. We need to get Parliament out of its addiction to big budgets and budget deficits. This is driven by perverse incentives around CDF. Parliament is not holding the executive to account. It is in bed with the executive. The Big Four agenda and national flagship projects are driving debt, yet there are no visible benefits on the ground for most of these projects. For instance, the impacts of the inland terminus and the SGR on residents and businesses of Mombasa has caused a loss of livelihoods and calls for the protection of, and calls by civil society for the protection of livelihoods have been ignored by government, who are subject to powerful interests in the national flagship projects. There is a symbiotic relationship between debts and corruption and very little to show for the money we have borrowed. What strategies do we need? We need to move and link up with global and regional debt campaigns. And I ask my colleague, Jacinda, I hope she's still on, to read the rest of the statement. Sheila, are you still on?
Yes, I am still on, struggling with network, but can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Thanks, Shiro. So it's really against this background that we call upon civil society actors to immediately work with relevant authorities, including the Office of the Auditor General, to institute a social evaluation process or processes to assess the viability of debt finance projects in the country and make recommendations as a basis for continued funding. We also call upon civil society actors to immediately work with the relevant bodies to institute an investigation into the responsible state and public officers who aided the undermining and violation of public finance and investment laws in the country. We call upon civil society actors to also work with relevant authorities to investigate the parliamentary oversight failures and propose appropriate action, to also work with relevant authorities to investigate the dual roles played by IFIs in development policy and debt financing, and the extent to which this have undermined the citizens' voices and sovereignty, and make recommendations to ensure the role of IFIs in Kenya development landscape is
to the Constitution of Kenya.
Sorry, I hope this must have been an interruption there. Sorry about that. We are also, I think that's the end of the statement. Shiro, if I read right, that's the end of the statement.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That's the end of the statement. And with that, I'd like to draw a close to our meeting today. And to say that we are very grateful and encouraged by your attendance. I'd like to appreciate the contributions and participation of the coalition members. I'd really like to appreciate our speakers, many of whom are coalition members, and those that aren't, we will still enlist. We look at this as a beginning of for the Okoa Uchumi Coalition to harness and build upon the recommendations that have been given today. We will share the outputs of this meeting, and we will continue working together, and let us take encouragement and also rise to the challenge that has been placed before us by those who have spoken today. So with that, I'd like to appreciate the TISA team that have put this meeting together, and also the dispatch team that have assisted us, and Oxfam, who have funded us in enabling us to undertake this work. We will be holding some media engagements next week through the support of Oxfam, and we are grateful for that. And as we close, I'd like to wish you all a very good afternoon, a good weekend, and we continue. Thank you so much, and thank you, Jessica. I can see your comments, and we will share the recordings once we edit them. Asanteni sana. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.